The quorum is present. This is the first hearing. We are conducting pursuant to House Resolution 660 and the Special Judiciary Committee procedures that are described in Section 4A of that resolution. Here is how the committee will proceed for this hearing. I will make an opening statement, and then I will recognize the ranking member for an opening statement. Each witness will have 10 minutes to make their statements, and then we will proceed to questions. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
I have the time for an opening statement. The parliamentary inquiry is not in order at this time. The facts before us are undisputed. On July 25th, President Trump called President Zelensky of Ukraine, and in President Trump's words, asked him for a favor. That call was part of a concerted effort by the president and his men to solicit a personal advantage in the next election, this time in the form of an investigation of his political adversaries by a foreign government. To obtain that private political advantage, President Trump withheld both an official White House meeting from the newly elected president of a fragile democracy and withheld vital military aid from a vulnerable ally. When Congress found out about this scheme and began to investigate, President Trump took extraordinary and unprecedented steps to cover up his efforts and to withhold evidence from the investigators. And when witnesses disobeyed him, when career professionals came forward and told us the truth, he attacked them viciously, calling them traitors and liars, promising that they will, quote, go through some things, close quote. Of course, this is not the first time that President Trump has engaged in this pattern of conduct. In 2016, the Russian government engaged in a sweeping and systematic campaign of interference in our elections. In the words of Special Counsel Robert Mueller, quote, the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, close quote. The president welcomed that interference. We saw this in real time when President Trump asked Russia to hack his political opponent. The very next day, a Russian military intelligence unit attempted to hack that political opponent. When his own Justice Department tried to uncover the extent to which a foreign government had broken our laws, President Trump took extraordinary and unprecedented steps to obstruct the investigation, including ignoring subpoenas, ordering the creation of false records, and publicly attacking and intimidating witnesses. Then as now, this administration's level of obstruction is without precedent. No other president has vowed to, quote, fight all of the subpoenas, unquote, as President Trump promised. In the 1974 impeachment proceedings, President Nixon produced dozens of recordings. In 1998, President Clinton physically gave his blood. President Trump, by contrast, has refused to produce a single document and directed every witness not to testify. Those are the facts before us. The impeachment inquiry has moved back to the House Judiciary Committee, and as we begin a review of these facts, the president's pattern of behavior becomes clear. President Trump welcomed foreign interference in the 2016 election. He demanded it for the 2020 election. In both cases, he got caught. And in both cases, he did everything in his power to prevent the American people from learning the truth about his conduct. On July 24th, the special counsel testified before this committee. He implored us to see the nature of the threat to our country. Quote, over the course of my career, I have seen a number of challenges to our democracy. The Russian government's effort to interfere in our elections is among the most serious. This deserves the attention of every American, close quote. Ignoring that warning, President Trump called the Ukrainian president the very next day to ask him to investigate the president's political opponent. As we exercise our responsibility to determine whether this pattern of behavior constitutes an impeachable offense, it is important to place President Trump's conduct into historical context. Since the founding of our country, a The House of Representatives has impeached only 2 presidents. The third was on his way to impeachment when he resigned. This committee has voted to impeach 2 presidents for obstructing justice. We have voted to impeach 1 president for obstructing a congressional investigation. To the extent that President Trump's conduct fits these categories, there is precedent for recommending impeachment here. But never before in the history of the Republic have we been forced to consider the conduct of a president who appears to have solicited personal political favors from a foreign government. Never before has a president engaged in a course of conduct that included all of the acts that most concerned the framers. The patriots who founded our country were not fearful men. They fought a war. They witnessed terrible violence. They overthrew a king. But as they met to frame our Constitution, those patriots still feared one threat above all: foreign interference in our elections. They had just deposed a tyrant. They were deeply worried that we would lose our newfound liberty, not through a war. If a foreign army were to invade, we would see that coming, but through corruption from within. And in the early years of the Republic, they asked us, each of us, to be vigilant to that threat. Washington warned us, quote, to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. Adams wrote to Jefferson, quote, as often as elections happen, the danger of foreign influence recurs. Hamilton's warning was more specific and more dire. In the Federalist Papers, he wrote that the, quote, most deadly adversaries of Republican government, unquote, would almost certainly attempt to, quote, raise a creature of their own to the chief magistracy of the Union. In short, the founders warned us that we should expect our foreign adversaries to target our elections, and that we will find ourselves in grave danger if the president willingly opens the door to their influence. What kind of president would do that? How will we know if the president has betrayed his country in this manner? How will we know if he has betrayed his country in this manner for petty personal gain? Hamilton had a response for that as well. He wrote, when a man unprincipled in private life, desperate in his fortune, bold in his temper, possessed of considerable talents, known to have scoffed in private at the principles of liberty, when such a man is seen to mount the hobby horse of popularity, to join the cry of danger to liberty, to take every opportunity of embarrassing the general government and bringing it under suspicion, it may justly be suspected that his object is to throw things into confusion, that he may ride the storm and direct the whirlwind. Ladies and gentlemen, the storm in which we find ourselves today was set in motion by President Trump. I do not wish this moment on the country. It is not a pleasant task that we undertake today, but we have each taken an oath to protect the Constitution, and the facts before us are clear. President Trump did not merely seek to benefit from foreign interference in our elections. He directly and explicitly invited foreign interference in our elections. He used the powers of his office to try to make it happen. He sent his agents to make clear that this is what he wanted and demanded. He was willing to compromise our security and his office for personal political gain. It does not matter that President Trump got caught and ultimately released the funds that Ukraine so desperately needed. It matters that he enlisted a foreign government to intervene in our elections in the first place. It does not matter that President Trump felt that these investigations were unfair to him. It matters that he used his office not merely to defend himself, but to obstruct investigators at every turn. We are all aware that the next election is looming, but we cannot wait for the election to address the present crisis. The integrity of that election is one of the very things at stake. The President has shown us his pattern of conduct. If we do not act to hold him in check now, President Trump will almost certainly try again to solicit interference in the election for his personal political gain. Today, we will begin our conversation where we should, with the text of the Constitution. We are empowered to recommend the impeachment of President Trump to the House if we find that he has committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Our witness panel will help us to guide that conversation. In a few days, we will reconvene and hear from the committees that worked to uncover the facts before us. And when we apply the Constitution to those facts, if it is true that President Trump has committed an impeachable offense or multiple impeachable offenses, then we must move swiftly to do our duty and charge him accordingly. I thank the witnesses for being here today. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee,
Mr. Chairman.
the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins,
Mr.
for
Chairman.
his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a parliamentary inquiry before you?
The gentleman is not in order for parliamentary inquiry. I've recognized the ranking member for an opening statement.
The obstruction of Congress is a problem because it undermines the basic principle of the Constitution. If you're going to have three branches of government, each of the branches has to be able to do its job. The job of the House is to investigate impeachment and to impeach. A president who says, as this president did say, I will not cooperate in any way, shape, or form with your process, robs a coordinate branch of government. He robs the House of Representatives of its basic constitutional power of impeachment. When you add to that the fact that the same president says, my Department of Justice cannot charge me with a crime, the president puts himself above the law when he says he will not cooperate in an impeachment inquiry. I don't think it's possible to emphasize this strongly enough. A president who will not cooperate in an impeachment inquiry is putting himself above the law. Now, putting yourself above the law as president is the core of an impeachable offense, because if the president could not be impeached for that, he would in fact not be responsible to anybody.
Does it matter to impeachment that the $391 million, U.S. taxpayer dollars, in military assistance that the president withheld was ultimately delivered? Professor Feldman, does that matter to the question of impeachment?
No, it does not. If the President of the United States attempts to abuse his office, that is a complete impeachable offense. The possibility that the President might get caught in the process of attempting to abuse his office and then not be able to pull it off does not undercut in any way the impeachability of the act. If you'll pardon a comparison, President Nixon was subject to articles of impeachment preferred by this committee for attempting to cover up the Watergate break-in. The fact that President Nixon was not ultimately successful in covering up the break-in was not grounds for not impeaching him. The attempt itself is the impeachable act.
Professor Carlin, does it matter to impeachment that the unfounded investigations the president sought were ultimately never announced?
No, it doesn't. And if I could give an example that I think shows why soliciting is enough. Imagine that you were pulled over for speeding by a police officer, and the officer comes up to the window and says, you were speeding, but you know, if you give me $20, I'll drop the ticket. And you look in your wallet and you say to the officer, I don't have the $20. The officer says, okay, well, just go ahead, have a nice day. The officer would still be guilty of soliciting a bribe there, even though he ultimately let you off without your paying. Soliciting itself is the impeachable offense, regardless whether the other person comes up with it. So imagine that the president had said, will you do us a favor, will you investigate Joe Biden? And the president of Ukraine said, you know what? No, I won't, because we've already looked into this and it's totally baseless. The president would still have committed an impeachable act, even if he had been refused right there on the phone. So I don't see why the ultimate decision has anything to do with the president's impeachable conduct.
What's the danger if Congress does not respond to that attempt?
Well, we've already seen a little bit of it, which is he gets out on the White House lawn and says, China, I think you should investigate Joe Biden.
Professor Gerhardt, your view?
I certainly would agree with what's been said. One of the things to understand from the history of impeachment is everybody who's impeached has failed. They failed to get what they wanted. And what they wanted was not just to do what they did, but to get away with it. And the point of impeachment is, it's made possible through investigation, is to catch that person, charge that person, and ultimately remove that person from office. But impeachments are always focusing on somebody who didn't quite get as far as they wanted to. It's as nobody's better than Professor Carlin at hypotheticals, but I'll dare to raise yet another one. Imagine a bank robbery, and the police come, and the person's in the middle of bank robbery, and the person then drops the money and says, I'm going to leave without the money. Everybody understands that's robbery. I mean, that's burglary. I'll get it right. Yeah. And in this situation, we've got somebody really caught in the middle of it, and that doesn't excuse the person from the consequences.
Professors, we've talked about abuse of power and bribery. When we started, we said we would also discuss obstruction of Congress. So I'd like to ask you some questions about obstruction of Congress. Professor Gerhardt, in your view, is there enough evidence here to charge President Trump with the high crime and misdemeanor of obstruction of Congress?
I think there's more than enough. As I mentioned in my statement, just to really underscore this, the third article of impeachment approved by the House Judiciary Committee against President Nixon charged him with misconduct because he had failed to comply with 4 legislative subpoenas. Here it is, far more than 4 that this president has failed to comply with, and he's ordered the executive branch as well not to cooperate with Congress. Those, together with a lot of other evidence, suggest obstruction of Congress.
Professor Carlin, do you agree?
I'm a scholar of the law of democracy. So as a citizen, I agree with what Professor Gerhardt said. As an expert, my limitation is that I'm a scholar of the law of democracy. I'm not a scholar of obstruction of justice or obstruction of Congress.
We will accept your opinion as a citizen. Professor Feldman.
The obstruction of Congress is a problem because it undermines the basic principle of the Constitution. If you're going to have 3 branches of government, each of the branches has to be able to do its job. The job of the House is to investigate impeachment and to impeach. A president who says, as this president did say, I will not cooperate in any way, shape, or form with your process, robs a coordinate branch of government. He robs the House of Representatives of its basic constitutional power of impeachment. When you add to that the fact that the same president says, my Department of Justice cannot charge me with a crime, the president puts himself above the law when he says he will not cooperate in an impeachment inquiry. I don't think it's possible to emphasize this strongly enough. A president who will not cooperate in an impeachment inquiry is putting himself above the law. Now, putting yourself above the law as president is the core of an impeachable offense, because if the president could not be impeached for that, he would in fact not be responsible to anybody.